divide the recording up. Okay, Seth, you are up. And again, I'll send you a message if you hit 12 minutes.
Cool.
There you go.
Is that?
Yep, that looks good. You have presenter mode off, at least for us. So that looks good to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm covering blockchain cryptosystems, which is kind of not a direct way of encrypting information, but it's a way of securing transactions, blocks of transactions that occur over time. So the main goals of a cryptosystem is to, of course, secure those transactions. The blocks are essentially arranged so that they are dependent on the previous block that occurred, which goes all the way back to the beginning of the ledger that you've created. Essentially, everything is recursively dependent on the previous blocks. So this sort of codependence creates a very irreversible or very hard to retract structure. And very hard is kind of the mathematical term where it is possible, but it should take more time than it's worth. Essentially one of Kirchhoff's principles. So of course we don't want any fraudulent transactions. And a way of doing that is to have the user base vet every block that is added. And there's ways of doing that, and it's different for public and private blockchains. So then we are also going to want to allow ownership of digital assets. The way digital assets is kind of the way they're handled is kind of interesting. You can't break them apart. They're sort of singular objects that you hand around. But they also kind of have their own blockchain within the blockchain. You can track them to their initial creation or initial introduction into the system. Then one of the problems with types of cryptocurrencies is the problem of double spending, which I will describe a little bit later. So a public blockchain requires that we have a public ledger. We have to be able to distribute this among a network of what's sometimes referred to as nodes of users who will hold on to it for us and also help produce the oncoming blocks. So everybody in the network is able to see what is happening, but oftentimes accounts can remain entirely anonymous. You just have a user ID, but there's no information intrinsically linked to that. And then one of the goals is that we have that vetting system. We have to be able to verify that the blocks going on are not fraudulent. So the implementation of such a system is kind of up in the air. The original implementation, practical implementation of a blockchain was given by a man called Satoshi Nakamoto, or not a man. Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym. We don't actually know who created Bitcoin, which was the original intention for blockchains, was to allow cryptosystems. But this initial implementation, the design document essentially ascribes that each transaction uses a different cryptosystem to securely hand off assets. So you might use RSA or eCDSA, some public crypto system. You also need a hash function to be able to shorten data, because you're going to have this dependence on the previous block. We don't want to carry along the entire block, because it's going to just continue to get larger and larger until we can't fit this on any of our systems. So every asset in the system, like I said before, can't actually be divided. It's sort of an ID or an amount, as with a cryptocurrency, and it belongs to somebody, and you essentially hold on to, or you remember where you were transferred it in the blockchain, and whenever you want to transfer it on, you just have to find that transactional data again. So if you want to change the ownership, you take that previous transactional data, you hash that so it's smaller, and then you sign it with your private key. So then whenever somebody wants to verify that it was sent to this person, they simply have to look at the transaction before your transfer, grab the public key of the person who claims it, put that together, hash it, and then use your public key, which you signed the hash with, to retrieve the hash of that bundle. So this is a bit of a diagram that was in the original Bitcoin documentation. It very much describes the owner's key being brought together, or the new owner's key being brought together with the previous transaction data, hashed, and then signed by the previous owner. So the block part of the blockchain is kind of the more interesting part. Transactions are essentially, you want to collect all of the transactions so you don't have to create a new sort of hash to verify each transaction and have each transaction based or dependent on the previous. So if you just grab a whole block of them, you can create a hash of that, but you base your hash off of the previous block's hash. So of course there is a genesis block, a sort of block that doesn't require any other information besides just itself. Otherwise you would have to have an infinite blockchain. So the way blocks are added on is important, because you could, hashes are very easy, of course, to compute. So you have to have a way of vetting incoming blocks. So a consensus method was offered by Satoshi. So for a private blockchain, this isn't very difficult, especially if you know everybody in the network. You could imagine if the world banks had a blockchain network, they would all have to verify who had what account and who was verifying all the transactions that were taking place. So there's a lot of trust in that sort of network. But the sort of design of a blockchain was to remove the need for a centralized authority. So this also needs to work in a public space. So in order to do that, you need sort of a proof of stake or proof of work to show that any block you create, you have no ill intentions, or at least it wouldn't be worth your time to create this block, either from a monetary standpoint or from a time and energy standpoint. And one of the general consensus requirements is that the longest chain is to be the most trustworthy. You don't want to spend your time creating blocks for a shorter chain. the chains can kind of be arranged into a big tree where there's a bunch of branches off, and whoever has the largest branch is considered the most trustworthy. So you could work on other branches, which is one of the attacks that can be run, is called the long range attack, where you create a chain off to the side and you eventually get past the mainline branch, and suddenly you're the most trustworthy block around. And so technically everybody should work on yours, on your chain. So the proof of work requires a difficult computation. For Bitcoin, this uses essentially a hashing method where you have to produce a hash with a certain number of zeros at the start of the code. Now, it's very difficult to figure out when or what sort of input will give you this output. So you kind of have to randomly choose. But the proof of stake method is to require good intentions. There are penalties if you're doing fraudulent activities. And then if you invest into a blockchain, then you get some money out. And with the proof of work, you also generally get some sort of reward for creating the block. And that's kind of the transaction fees that Bitcoin at least has. So the proof of work security is actually pretty decent with an active network. This kind of breaks Kirchhoff's principle, where the implementation is actually a weak point of blockchain. Essentially, if you have less than 51% of control over the network's computation or assets, you will fail to create fraudulent blocks at an exponential rate. And he describes this as the gambler's ruin problem. If you have less than a 51% chance, you will essentially never make up your money, and you'll exponentially begin to lose all of your assets. So I sort of described that here. But there are also some vulnerabilities. Hashes are pretty secure yet, and there's only some theoretical weaknesses with quantum computing. Essentially, a quantum computer can check a lot of hashes very quickly. So it could pose a threat to it, but it's generally, there's so many specialized hardware for creating blockchains, especially with hashes, that it's really not comparable, or may not ever be comparable if it's only a couple quantum computers. So then, to wrap things up, human error is a major issue. Private keys can be lost or stolen very easily. It's just like a number on your computer. If somebody finds that file where you keep it, you've lost everything. And then centralized holders, some people use sort of a bank kind of to hold their Bitcoin, so they don't have to hold on to the private keys. But of course, those can lead to fraud. And that's a very general overview of blockchains.
All right, thank you. Questions for Seth? Daniel, yep, go ahead.
So this is an unbroken crypto system?
The crypto system has been broken by these means. It actually has also been broken by the 51% attack. That's why it breaks Kirchhoff's principle. The implementation is important. Essentially, individuals can target smaller blockchain networks with greater amounts of power or assets and overpower it, at least temporarily. Once that sort of activity is seen, sometimes that just brings more people to the network to secure it. To break Bitcoin, fun fact, it would take around $250,000 an hour of electricity costs alone. So that one, Bitcoin is pretty secure, but you can break smaller blockchains easily.
All right, any other questions for Seth?
Do you own any Bitcoin, Seth?
I do not.
Do you think cryptocurrency is ever going to be something that we actually use?
I could see banks sort of doing that private network, which would, I believe it was my Harvard fellows on this page. Where are they? Harvard Business. Ian Sidi and Karim essentially said that a smaller private network of banks could drastically increase the speed of transactions if they were to implement a blockchain just between themselves and like the federal government.
Excellent. All right, I'll have you stop sharing your screen. Thank you. Excellent. All right, so we are 2/3 of the way done with live presentations. We've got one more set on Wednesday. Cody, John, and Jason, you guys are all up on Wednesday. So I will again sign in a little bit early, and then you guys can practice sharing your screen, make sure that it's all set and ready to go. People who are pre-recording, those are due at noon, please and thank you. So either submit the link in Moodle, or you can email me the link too if you need to. But get those submitted, and then I will put together a list of those links and send them out to everybody so you can view some of those if you want to also. Don't forget, you are responsible for 5 feedback forms. You guys are watching more than 5, that's great. Thank you for being interested in your classmates' stuff, but you are responsible for 5 feedback forms, whichever ones you want. Homework's due at noon. If you wrote a program, make sure to email that to Dr. Schultz and copy me, and make sure to please submit your homework as a PDF. That makes my life so very much easier. Any other questions on all of those reminders? Anything else? All good? All right then, I will see you on Wednesday, and submit your presentations, please and thank you. Have a good day, guys. Thanks.